Picture a man. He's in his mid-50s, he has worked for 30 years, paid his taxes, raised his family, and driven the same succession of sensible, forgettable cars that a sensible income allowed him to choose. He is not a wealthy man. He's not a man who spends money without thinking. But today is different. Today, he's walking into a Rover dealership. It is the early 2000s. The showroom is clean, it smells of carpet and polish, and that particular quiet that car dealerships work very hard to manufacture. No aggressive colors on the walls, no neon, no shrieking sale banners. This is a Rover showroom. It is meant to feel calm. It is meant to feel British. He walks past a brochure stand, past a salesman who nods politely and does not pounce. And then he sees it. The Rover 75. It is sitting under the lights the way a well-dressed person sits in a good restaurant. Not demanding attention, not performing, simply present and entirely confident in its own presence. The chrome catches the light without showing off. The proportions are correct in the way that only a handful of cars in any given era manage to be correct. It is not sporty, it is not aggressive, it is not trying to be German, it is not trying to be anything other than what it is. A proper British saloon. He walks around it slowly. He opens the door and sits in the driver's seat. He runs his hands over the steering wheel. The wood, the leather, the dials that look like they belong in a gentleman's study rather than a budget rental. And something happens that does not happen with data sheets or comparison charts. He feels proud. He signs the paperwork. The 2.5 V6 he has chosen comes in at around £18,000, more than he has spent on any car in his life. He drives it home. The salesman shakes his hand at the door. He parks it on his driveway and for a moment he just looks at it. He has bought a British car. Not because it was the cheapest, not because it was the fastest, but because when he sat in it, he felt like someone had built it for him. He does not know what you're about to know. Within 18 months, the company behind that car will be on the verge of total collapse. The factory that built it will fall silent. The warranty that came with it will become almost meaningless. The parts network will fracture. The dealer network will disintegrate. The brand he just bought into, with his savings, with his pride, will cease to exist as a functioning manufacturer. And the car he bought with such pride will become, almost overnight, a symbol not of British craftsmanship, but of national betrayal. He thought he was buying the last great British saloon. What he was really buying was the final chapter of a company whose survival was already in serious doubt. And the people selling it to him knew the situation was serious. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is documented, investigated, and in key aspects confirmed by government inquiries, by administrators' reports, and by the very public unraveling of everything that came next. So the question is not simply why Rover failed. History is full of companies that failed. The question is this: who was still selling the dream while the dream was already collapsing around them? What the Rover 75 actually was. To understand why the Rover 75 mattered, you have to understand what it was competing with. Not technically, emotionally. By the late 1990s, the premium saloon market in Britain had already been largely surrendered. Not officially, but in practice, in the forecourts, the company car parks, the fleet allocation spreadsheets, the outcome was already clear. If you wanted a premium European saloon, you bought German. BMW for performance and status, Mercedes for solidity, Audi for the quietly confident professional. Even Volvo had carved its own territory. What remained for a British car? What was the argument? The argument was the Rover 75. And here is something worth saying at the outset. The Rover 75 was a genuinely good car. Not world-beating, not flawless, but genuinely good in the ways that mattered to the people it was built for. Designed during Rover's period under BMW ownership, which is one of the great ironies at the heart of this story. The car that would become Britain's most emotionally resonant saloon of its era was conceived by a German parent company, styled by Richard Woolley and his team with a design language that deliberately reached back through Rover's heritage. The P5, the P6, a lineage of cars that had once sat in ministerial driveways and the garages of the kind of English professional who wore a tie to the office every day because he had decided that standards mattered. The Rover 75 launched at the 1998 Birmingham Motor Show, which felt appropriate. Birmingham was Rover's city. Longbridge was Rover's heartbeat, and the 75 was meant to be Rover's proof that there was still a place for a British alternative to the relentless German advance. On purely aesthetic terms, the argument was strong. The grille was upright and slightly formal, the lines were gentle curves. The proportions suggested a saloon designed not for track days but for long, quiet motorway journeys and the gravel drives of country hotels. Inside, the wood veneer was real. The leather was a decision, not an afterthought. The BMW-sourced diesels, particularly the 2.0 CDTI, were genuinely strong units. The 2.5 V6 was smooth, refined entirely at home with the car's character. Nothing was sensational, nothing was meant to be sensational. The point was that this car felt handmade in a way that cars increasingly did not. And in a market dominated by German precision, there was a constituency of buyers who did not want precision as their primary experience. They wanted warmth. They wanted character. They wanted to feel that the car had been built by people who understood a particular kind of British life. The Rover 75 was not bought with logic alone. It was bought with memory. Memory of Austin, of Morris, of Triumph, of MG. Of a manufacturing culture that had once made Britain one of the great motor nations of the world and had been eroding for 3 decades. Every man who walked into a Rover showroom in 2000 or 2001 or 2002 carried some version of that memory. A father's Rover SD1, a grandfather's P6. A childhood in the back seat of something British, something that smelled of Connolly leather and quiet engineering confidence. The Rover 75 spoke directly to that memory. It made you feel that Britain could still build a proper car. That if you bought this, you were supporting something real, something worth supporting. That feeling was genuine. The car was genuinely good in the ways it needed to be good. The problem was not the car. The problem was what was standing behind it. And this is where the story stops being about nostalgia. This is where it starts becoming something harder, because the problem with selling national pride is that someone, somewhere, has to be honest about what is actually standing behind it. And behind the Rover 75, by the time most buyers signed their finance agreements and handed over their old cars in part exchange, the truth was already beginning to rot. Who was selling it and what they knew? To understand the real shape of this story, you have to go back to May 2000. Back to what may be the single most extraordinary transaction in the history of British motoring. BMW had spent years and billions of pounds trying to make Rover work. The Rover 75 was the most visible result of that investment. But the wider challenges had proved too deep, the losses too persistent. BMW had had enough. They kept Mini. They sold Land Rover to Ford for £1.8 billion, which tells you a great deal about what they considered worth keeping. And what remained, the Rover marque, the Longbridge factory, the MG brand, the existing model range, was sold to a group of British businessmen calling themselves the Phoenix Consortium. They paid £10, not 10 million, not 10,000, £10, less than a tank of petrol, less than a round of drinks at a Birmingham pub. A company whose name had been part of British life for over a century was sold for less than the price of a restaurant dinner. The sale to Phoenix for £10 was not a rescue. It was a disposal dressed as one. The 4 men behind Phoenix, John Towers, Nick Stevenson, Peter Beale and John Edwards, presented themselves publicly as saviours, men who believed in British manufacturing when the Germans had given up, and in the immediate aftermath they were largely treated as exactly that. The workers at Longbridge cheered, the tabloids celebrated, politicians welcomed it. Here was the buyout that would save the most iconic remaining name in British mass-market motoring. But what exactly had they taken back? The inheritance was not what the headlines suggested. The Rover 25 and 45 were old platforms wearing polished new clothes, dressed-up versions of cars that had been aging for years without the engineering investment to take them forward. There was nothing in the pipeline to challenge Volkswagen at the lower end or BMW and Mercedes above. The financial position was precarious from day one. BMW had provided a cash cushion as part of the deal, but it was finite and burning. Phoenix needed manufacturing partners. They needed new platforms. They needed new engine programs. Without an alliance that delivered competitive new product, they were not running a car company. They were managing a countdown. They talked to Volkswagen, to Fiat, to various others. None of it delivered what Rover needed, and all the while, in showrooms across Britain, the cars were still being sold. The Rover 75 sat under its lights. The brochures were polished, the salespeople were professional. Buyers were signing 3- and 5-year PCP agreements, committing to monthly payments on the assumption that the company behind the car would still exist when those agreements matured. The car came with a warranty, with the promise of servicing, with the implicit assurance of a going concern. The buyers were not told they were taking a bet on the survival of a manufacturer already fighting for its life. They were sold a car as if they were buying into a future. This is where the story stops being sad and starts becoming something that deserves a harder word, because by the time MG Rover reached its final years, the situation internally was not simply uncertain. It was known to be critical. The accounts were known. The cash position was monitored. The failure of partnership talks was understood. The product pipeline, or rather the catastrophic absence of one, was visible to anyone positioned to look. The trajectory of the company was not a secret to the people running it. There were people in the specialist automotive press who raised concerns. There were analysts who pointed publicly to the fragility of the situation. There were moments when the underlying precariousness broke through to the surface of public discourse before being smoothed back down by carefully worded statements about ongoing discussions and positive progress, and the continued commitment of all parties. The official line was that negotiations were advancing, that a deal was close, that British manufacturing was not on a death march but on a recovery road. Whether the Phoenix directors maintained a genuine personal belief that a rescue was still achievable is something no external observer can determine with certainty. Human beings can hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously. It is possible to know something is likely and still act as though an alternative outcome remains within reach. That is a very human quality, but it is also when applied by people in positions of authority over a company still selling products to the public on the basis of implied long-term promises, a quality with consequences. Those consequences were borne by other people. Someone new. Someone always knows before ordinary people do. The concessionaires themselves were in many cases not part of the problem. They were ordinary business people who had built their livelihoods around the Rover franchise. Many had no greater visibility into the company's true position than their customers. They were caught between a corporate structure they did not control and a customer base that trusted the badge above the door. They were, in their own right, victims of the same gap between appearance and reality. But the gap was real. And eventually, inevitably, it closed. When that future collapsed, the damage was not abstract. It landed on driveways across Britain. The concrete damage. MG Rover went into administration on the 8th of April 2005. It was a Friday. By the following week, the full weight of what that meant was being felt in very specific, very personal, very non-abstract ways by people who had done nothing wrong except trust a British name. Let us be concrete about what this meant. A buyer who had paid £18,000 for a Rover 75 V6 in 2003 under a 3-year PCP agreement might have been 18 months into that agreement when the company collapsed. His car was 2 years old, in reasonable condition, mechanically sound, under normal circumstances, with a functioning manufacturer behind it, a healthy dealer network, a credible brand. A 2-year-old Rover 75 might be worth £10,000 to £12,000 on the forecourt. Depreciation hurts, but it is predictable. You plan for it. What was not planned for was this. Within weeks of the administration, dealers were offering £3,000 to £4,000 for used Rover 75s. Not because the car had developed faults, not because it had been maltreated, but because no dealer wanted stock they could not move, and buyers who knew about the collapse were not walking into forecourts asking for a Rover. The badge on the bonnet had not changed, but the number a dealer was willing to put on paper had fallen off a cliff. For buyers on PCP agreements, the mathematics became especially cruel. The guaranteed future value, the amount the finance company had promised the car would be worth at the end of the agreement, had been calculated on the assumption that Rover was a functioning manufacturer. When Rover ceased to be a functioning manufacturer, those assumptions became fiction. Customers who had planned to hand the car back and walk away were discovering that their options had narrowed considerably, and the monthly payments continued regardless. Then there was the warranty. When MG Rover collapsed, the manufacturer's warranty backing collapsed with it. A warranty is not a theoretical document. It is a promise that requires a functioning infrastructure to honour. Parts, authorised dealers, a corporate body with the resources to process and pay claims. When MG Rover entered administration, that infrastructure began to fracture immediately. Some claims continued through transitional arrangements. Others fell into a grey area that was expensive and time-consuming to navigate. Many owners who needed work that should have been covered under warranty found themselves facing a choice: pay out of pocket or spend months pursuing a claim against administrators who had rather more pressing priorities. Repairs that should have cost nothing were suddenly costing hundreds, sometimes more, on a car that had already lost a substantial portion of its market value overnight. Parts became a further concern. Genuine shortages developed in some areas, dealers found themselves unable to source components through channels that had previously worked. The aftermarket and dedicated owners' clubs have done remarkable work since to maintain supply. But in the months immediately following the collapse, owners trying to carry out routine maintenance sometimes discovered it was less routine than it should have been. The dealer network fractured with real consequences. Some Rover dealerships had invested substantial sums in premises, in training, in franchise fees, in the full infrastructure of representing a major brand. Those investments had been made on the basis that Rover was viable. When it was not, many dealers found their own businesses suddenly unviable. Forecourts became empty car parks. Staff lost their jobs on the same morning as the factory workers in Birmingham. Think about this at the level of a single kitchen table. A couple sits down with their bank statements, 2 years into a 5-year finance agreement on a car they bought carefully and in good faith. The car is on the driveway. It runs fine. Nothing has broken. But the company that built it is gone, the warranty is in question, the trade-in value is a fraction of what they expected, and the agreement they are committed to was calculated on assumptions that no longer exist. They did not make a reckless choice. They trusted a British name that was being sold as stable long after stability had quietly become doubtful. And the bill came to them, not to the boardroom, to the kitchen table. People did not lose money because they made a reckless choice. They lost money because they trusted a British name that was being sold as stable long after stability had disappeared, but if the buyers paid on their driveways, the workers paid at the gates of Longbridge. Longbridge. There is a way of describing industrial collapse that keeps the human reality at a comfortable distance, a language of market forces and competitive pressures and strategic misalignment, the vocabulary of business analysis, which turns catastrophe into case study. That language is not adequate for what happened at Longbridge in April 2005. When MG Rover went into administration, approximately 6,000 people were directly employed at Longbridge. 6,000 people who had arrived at those gates on an ordinary working morning with no reason to believe the day would be different. Who had mortgages and car payments and children in school and plans for the weekend. Who had, many of them, built their entire working lives around that factory. Because Longbridge was not just a job. It was a geography. It was a neighborhood. It was an identity. Longbridge was not just a factory, it was a place where fathers, sons, neighbours and entire streets had built their lives around the same gates. The factory at Longbridge had been producing cars since 1905. 100 years. Workers whose grandfathers had passed through those gates brought their own children to the same place. The rhythms of the surrounding neighbourhood were built around the factory. The shift patterns, the pub trade at clock-out time, the corner shops, the schools, the bus routes, the entire social fabric of streets where almost everyone either worked at Longbridge or knew someone who did. When the gates closed, none of that fabric was preserved in amber. It unraveled. The knock-on effect through the supply chain was severe and swift. For every direct Longbridge job, estimates suggested several more in the supplier base, and the wider regional economy were at immediate risk. Components manufacturers who had built their entire order books around MG Rover faced cancellations with no notice and no alternative customer of comparable scale. The ecosystem around a large-scale car manufacturer is vast and deeply interconnected. When the anchor is removed, the smaller boats do not drift peacefully. They capsize. The West Midlands in 2005 was not a region positioned to absorb this lightly. The manufacturing base that had once made Birmingham one of the great industrial heartlands of Europe had already been hollowing out for 2 decades. Rover was not the beginning of that story, but it may have been its most visible and most painful chapter. The government response involved task forces and emergency funding and political statements of commitment. Some of this helped, but government task forces do not replace what a 100-year-old factory means to a community that has built itself around it. They cannot. What had been lost was not simply employment. What had been lost was something harder to replace, a piece of British manufacturing confidence and a community sense of what it was and where it stood. This was not only a business failure, it was the failure of a country to decide what its industrial heritage was worth before it was gone. And then to find, after it was gone, that the answer it had failed to give had been given for it, by events, at a cost that fell on people who had not been invited to the conversation. The older workers faced the hardest reckoning. For a man of 55 who had worked in the same factory for 30 years, retraining is not the same option it is for a man of 25. The skills are there, but the industry that valued them has gone. And the sense of identity that the job provided, the simple, solid knowledge of what you did and why it mattered, that does not transfer easily to a government retraining scheme. And when the dust settled, one question remained. A question that deserves to be asked plainly and answered plainly. Who actually paid the price? Who paid the price and who did not? This is the part of the story that the official post-mortems handled most carefully, and it is the part that deserves to be handled most directly. The distribution of consequences in the collapse of MG Rover was not random. It was not even, it had a very clear shape. And that shape is one of the more uncomfortable documented facts in recent British corporate history. The buyers paid, the workers paid, the families paid, the suppliers paid, the dealers paid, the communities paid. These are the people whose names do not appear in the headline coverage. They are not the protagonists of the corporate story. They are the people who went to bed one evening in April with an ordinary expectation of an ordinary tomorrow, and discovered the following morning that the world they had organized themselves around had changed. The man on the driveway with the Rover 75 paid. He paid in depreciation that wiped out money he had expected to protect. He paid in monthly finance installments on a car whose market value had collapsed while his contractual obligation had not. He paid in warranty claims honored partially, slowly, or not at all. He paid in the quiet humiliation of offering a car for part exchange and being told the number had changed, quite dramatically, since he last looked. The man at the factory gates paid. He paid with a job he had invested 30 years in. He paid with a pension subject to its own complications in the wake of the collapse. He paid with a future he had planned on the basis of an employment that had been withdrawn. And then there are the people at the other end of the story. The four principals of the Phoenix Consortium, John Towers, Nick Stevenson, Peter Beale and John Edwards, became known in the aftermath as the Phoenix Four. Their conduct during MG Rover's final years became the subject of a detailed government inquiry lasting years, running to thousands of pages. The inquiry found that the four men had arranged substantial pension provisions and payments for themselves during the period of their stewardship. The collective value of pension arrangements put in place for the four of them during the period they ran MG Rover has been documented at figures in the tens of millions of pounds. Fees were paid, salaries were drawn, financial arrangements were secured. Meanwhile, the ordinary pension scheme for Longbridge workers, the scheme the people on the shop floor were depending on for their retirement, faced its own difficulties in the wake of the collapse, with workers receiving less than they had been promised. Let that asymmetry sit for a moment. While MG Rover's survival was in serious and worsening doubt, while the company was burning through its cash reserves, failing to secure the manufacturing partnerships it needed, continuing to sell cars on warranties and promises it may not have been able to keep, the men at the top were putting in place financial arrangements that would insulate them personally from the consequences of what was coming. This video makes no allegations beyond what has been publicly documented. The legal and ethical questions around what the Phoenix Four knew when they knew it and what obligations they held remain disputed in some respects. The accounting firm that signed off MG Rover's accounts, Deloitte, faced its own professional disciplinary proceedings as a result of its role in the affair. But you do not need to establish criminal intent to see the asymmetry for what it is. The people furthest from the boardroom paid the highest price. The people closest to the decisions did not feel the collapse in the same way. A man who paid £18,000 for a Rover 75 and found it worth £4,000 18 months later lost money he could not recover. A man who lost his Longbridge job at 52 with a reduced pension lost things that cannot be expressed in a single number. A family in Birmingham whose father came home on an April afternoon and said the factory was closed lost something that no task force could fully replace. The Rover 75 was sold to ordinary people as pride. The collapse handed them the bill. And perhaps the most painful part is this: it did not have to end quite like this. Could it have been different? History is dangerous when viewed through hindsight. Decisions made under genuine uncertainty look very different from a decade's distance. This is worth acknowledging before assessing the choices that were made. But acknowledging the difficulty of decisions is not the same as saying better decisions were impossible. Begin with BMW. Their management of Rover has been characterized, including by German commentators, with no axe to grind, as a case study in how not to handle an acquisition. The investment was real but inconsistent and culturally mismanaged. The Rover 75 showed what was possible when proper resources were applied, But that investment was not replicated across the model range, and the model range was what determined whether Rover could survive in volume. When BMW decided to exit, the manner of that exit matters. They kept Mini, the asset with genuine global brand potential. They sold Land Rover to Ford for £1.8 billion. And they sold what remained, including the Longbridge factory and the Rover name itself, for £10. That was not a rescue operation, that was an act of corporate housekeeping. Could BMW have secured a more credible long-term future for Rover before exiting? Could they have sold to a buyer with greater industrial resources and a clearer plan? The Rover 75 was the proof that something better was possible. A different parent with more patience might have produced a different story. Then there is the British government. The political dimension of Rover's collapse is uncomfortable for both parties that held power at relevant points. The failure to develop an industrial policy capable of supporting British manufacturing against the coordinated state-industry relationships in Germany, France, and Japan spans decades and governments. What is less disputed is that the absence of any coherent framework left MG Rover in its final years entirely dependent on the private choices of whoever happened to be running it. There was no institutional safety net, no government partner with a stake in the outcome, no equivalent of the support mechanisms that have sustained manufacturers in comparable positions elsewhere in Europe. As for Phoenix itself, the question of whether they ever had a credible industrial plan, a genuine financially viable path to making MG Rover a sustainable business, was examined in depth during the inquiry. The answer, assessed without sentimentality, is that the plan was always thin, dependent on partnerships that were being pursued but not secured, dependent on new product development that never received the investment it required. The business was operating for much of its existence on hope rather than strategy. The discussions with Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, SAIC, raised genuine hopes in Rover's final period. A deal with SAIC could, in theory, have provided the capital and the access to new platforms that Rover desperately needed. Those discussions were real. Agreements were initiated. There was a period when it seemed to those watching from outside that a partnership was genuinely close. But those discussions did not deliver. Whether a more competent negotiating approach, or different terms, or more time could have produced a different outcome remains one of the genuinely unresolvable counterfactuals of this story. What is resolvable is the observation that even the most optimistic reading of those SAIC talks, even assuming a deal had eventually been struck, would have required MG Rover to survive long enough for the benefits of the partnership to materialize. And surviving required money the company did not have, and partners the company could not secure in time. The countdown was always running. The buyers in the showrooms were not told the clock was ticking. But here is the thing that matters most. Whatever the broader failures of BMW, of government, of industrial policy, none of that uncertainty was communicated to the buyers. They were not given a risk assessment. They were not told the company's survival is in serious doubt. The partnership talks have not produced results. The cash is running out, and the future of your warranty and your car's resale value are genuinely uncertain. They were told, this is the last great British saloon. Sign here. Maybe Rover could not have been saved permanently, but the people buying its final cars deserved more honesty than they got. That is not a complicated moral position. It simply requires the proposition that when a company knows its situation is critical and continues to sell products to ordinary people on implied promises, it may not be able to keep. Something has gone wrong that goes beyond bad luck or poor management. That obligation was not met. And that brings us back to the car itself. The Rover 75, still out there on British roads, sitting in a strange place between failure and something approaching affection. The car that outlived its maker. Something unexpected happened to the Rover 75 after the collapse. It survived. Not the company, not the factory, but the cars themselves. The actual metal and leather and walnut and chrome that were produced and sold and driven home with such complicated feelings, they are still here. More of them than you might expect, given everything. There is an active Rover 75 owners club, genuinely committed, genuinely preserving the knowledge and parts availability that would otherwise be lost to time. There are specialists across Britain who know these cars intimately, who can rebuild a V6, who know exactly which gaskets fail and why, who can source trim pieces and electrical components the mainstream parts suppliers stopped stocking years ago. And when you encounter a well-kept Rover 75 today, not a photograph, the actual car, something happens worth paying attention to. You understand at last what all the fuss was about. The proportions still work. That combination of upright formality and quiet elegance that seemed slightly old-fashioned in 2001 reads very differently now. Now it reads as deliberate, as an argument, as the aesthetic expression of a point of view about what a car should communicate. In an era of increasingly anonymous road presence, of cars shaped by wind tunnels toward convergent aerodynamic efficiency, the Rover 75 looks genuinely distinctive. Not for its own sake, but because it believed in something. The interior holds up in a way that is genuinely surprising. The wood veneer was not a cynical marketing exercise. The leather was the product of a design philosophy about what the experience of a premium British car should feel like. And while the ergonomics are dated and the technology is by contemporary standards almost non-existent, there is something about sitting in a well-maintained Rover 75 cabin that no modern car of comparable price quite replicates. It has warmth. It has what the automotive press once called personality, deploying the word with slight condescension, as if personality were a consolation prize for cars that could not manage performance. Now, in a world of screens and haptic touchpads and driver assistance systems that treat the act of driving as a problem to be managed, personality sounds less like a consolation and more like a reminder of something that was quietly lost. It may be worth more emotionally now because everything behind it is gone. This is the strange alchemy of loss. The Rover 75, stripped of its context, stripped of the failing company, the showroom anxiety, the approaching collapse, has become something it never quite managed to be while it was in production. It has become a statement, a thing with meaning that exceeds its mechanical specification. It is the last Rover, not in the technical sense, but in the sense that matters. A genuinely designed, genuinely British saloon made by a company with a coherent idea of what a Rover should be, executed with real skill and real craft. After the 75, there was no more of that. There has been no more of that. Now go back to the man from the opening of this story. It is some years later. He still has the car. Some people in his situation sold theirs quickly, took the loss, moved on to something German, and tried not to think about it. He understands why. He was tempted himself in those first months after the collapse, when the offers on the forecourt were painful and every mention of it felt like a reminder of something he would rather not have been reminded of. But he kept it. He keeps it because it still drives well when properly maintained, because there is a specialist 40 minutes away who knows these cars better than the main dealers ever did, because every time he washes it and polishes the chrome and parks it back on the driveway, he feels something complicated. Not quite pride, not quite grief. Something that contains elements of both. He did not get what he was promised. He got the car without the future it was supposed to represent. He got the object without the context that was supposed to make the investment make sense. And yet he keeps it, because it represents something that has not been replaced. The last time a British manufacturer built a car specifically for him, for the man he was, for the values he held, for the idea of Britain he carried, with real wood and real leather and real attention, with his identity in mind rather than his data profile. The Rover 75 was not just Britain's last Rover, it was the car that people bought when they still believed the story, and by the time they understood the story was ending, they were already holding the keys. The question that remains: the story of the Rover 75 is not really a story about a car, it is a story about a country and its relationship with its own industrial identity. About the distance between the image of pride and the reality of decline, about who bears the cost when that gap finally, publicly, undeniably closes. The car itself was not the failure. The Rover 75 was a genuinely accomplished piece of design and engineering. The people who designed it believed in what they were doing. The people who built it at Longbridge were skilled workers doing their jobs to the standards they had always maintained. The people who bought it were making a legitimate, reasonable choice in a free market, on the basis of information that was controlled by people with interests that were not always identical to the buyers. The failure was systemic. The failure of a German parent that treated Britain's most historic manufacturing brand as a write-off to be disposed of at minimum administrative cost. The failure of a government that had decided industrial policy was not its business, and then seemed surprised when the consequences of that decision arrived in Birmingham on an April morning. The failure of a management structure that, whatever its intentions, arranged its own financial security, while the people who trusted it were still signing purchase agreements in showrooms across the country. And through all of it, the cars were sold. The brochures were refreshed, the finance deals were packaged, the warranty documents were printed and signed. Right up to the end, the Rover 75 continued to sit under its showroom lights and be presented to buyers who were not in possession of the information they needed to make a genuinely free and informed decision about whether to sign. There is a phrase that surfaces occasionally in discussions of corporate responsibility: the duty of candor, the obligation of those who hold information that materially affects other people's decisions to share that information honestly and in time for it to be useful. It is a principle applied in medicine, in law, in finance. It is a principle that asks, at its simplest, that the person selling you something does not omit the things you would most want to know. The buyers of the Rover 75 in its final years were not given that candor. They were given a brochure and a handshake and a finance package and a car that was, in almost every physical sense, exactly what it appeared to be. The failure was not in the car. The failure was in everything surrounding it. The Rover 75 did not fail Britain. Britain failed the Rover 75. And in doing so, it failed the buyers, the workers, the families, the communities, and the idea, imperfect, sometimes self-deceiving, but real, that Britain was still a country that could build something to be proud of and stand behind it when it mattered. Did Britain lose Rover because the cars were not good enough, or because the people in charge stopped believing in them before the buyers did? The honest answer is probably both. The cars were good enough to deserve a better story. The people in charge had lost faith, or lost the means to act on whatever faith remained, before the story had run its course. And the buyers, the workers, and the communities caught between those two realities paid the price for a gap they had not created and could not close. So was the Rover 75 a misunderstood classic, or the most elegant warning sign Britain refused to read? Tell us in the comments. Tell us if you owned one, what you paid, what you lost, what you kept, and why. Tell us if your father owned one, or if someone you knew worked at Longbridge. Tell us if you think the buyers were betrayed, or whether the collapse was simply inevitable and the timing simply brutal. Because this is not only history. For thousands of people across Britain, this was their money, their job, their community, their life. And stories like this one deserve to be told by the people who lived them. If this story matters to you, subscribe to Revian. Because Rover was not the only British name we lost. It was simply one of the most painful.